one of the co-chairs along with Lakayana of PSEP, and if you are a PSEP member, if you could just write to me in the chat so I could know to get you to introduce yourselves, and I'll just call on people so it's easier. So Lakayana.
Lakayana, he, him pronouns, co-chair of PSEP, also member of the Race Equity Subcommittee.
Kia.
Hi everyone, this is Kia Myers-Dugan. I am a PSEP member.
Yes, we're very excited to have Kia. She's our newest member. I think Anne is here as well. Anne, yes, Anne.
Hi everyone, Ann Campbell. I'm an alternate co-chair of the steering committee and a PSEP member. Thank you.
And I see Vadim.
Hi everybody, Vadim Mazursky. Thank you for attending this meeting. I look forward to hearing from everybody.
And Amy.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Amy Anderson. I'm the chair of the Behavioral Health Subcommittee.
Okay, any other PSEP members here who who've not introduced themselves yet? Great. Theo has already introduced himself, and I think Claudia is also here. Claudia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Claudia. I am a project assistant for PSEP. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. So our fearless staff, without which very little of what we do can happen. So the sole purpose of tonight is to focus on the COCL report, third quarter report that Dennis Rosenbaum and his colleague Tom Christoph and company have prepared for us. I hope you all had a chance to see it over this past week and read through it. There have been some news reports summarizing it. So the order of events today will be Dennis and Tom will do a brief presentation about their report, and then we will have PSEP members and public engage in lively discussion and questions about the report. So I'll be facilitating the first half of this meeting, and then Lakayana, my brother and co-chair, will take over the second half. So without further ado, Dennis or Tom, I don't know which of you wants to start off. Or you should introduce yourselves too.
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, I'm Dennis Rosenbaum. I think I know most of you. And Tom is here somewhere, and he's going to be on the agenda here soon. I think Tom has control of our PowerPoint, so I'll count on him for that. I just,
you want me to put it up now?
In a minute, yeah, not quite yet. I just, want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this virtual town hall, or whatever we want to call it. It tells me that you care about the city of Portland, the people who live there, and the quality of police services. As someone who grew up in the Portland area there, and I attended high school there, Central Catholic High School on Stark Street, this project is quite a bit more to me than just a work assignment. It's personal. I do care deeply about Portland community. I have lots of family and friends there, so it's been an honor to do this, and it's also been a challenge. So Tom, why don't you put up the PowerPoint so we can just go through some of the slides, and the first one I want to talk about is the questions basically remain the same. I think it's the next slide after that. We have the same questions in this maintenance year that we had before. Basically has the city and the Portland Police Bureau, which I will sometimes call PPB, sustain the kind of systems that they needed for the reform during this maintenance year. For those of you who maybe weren't involved, I want you to recall that the police department, the Bureau, achieved full compliance after 5 years on January 10th of this year, and had to remain in compliance for 1 year. And we'll come back to that issue. The question is, have they also continued to collect data and analysis to identify problems and trends? in use of force and other factors, and provide feedback to themselves as a learning organization would do, and to the public as a transparent organization would do. And then have they continue to conduct self-evaluations and make adjustments as needed. And that's what I mean by feedback to themselves. And clearly our assessment here is that unfortunately, the Portland Police Bureau was unable to remain in substantial compliance due to the problems with its use of force and its training systems. In our last report, we promised to give you some assessment of PPB's response to the protests. In our next report, we'll do that here in two ways. First, we'll make some comments on the protests in general, and then we'll look at how they've affected PPB's ability to comply with the requirements of the settlement agreement. And we're not able to give a step-by-step analysis of each confrontation that's happened or a full pattern analysis because honestly, we don't have all the adequate documentation on use of force. And there are certain cases too, as you know, that are being pursued through investigations and lawsuits, and that will take some time as well. But before we delve into this, I mean, I guess I want to make one comment about adequate data. You know, I've said this from the first day I started on this project in Portland that I've recommended that officers wear body cameras. And I'll just say that, you know, Portland's the only community that in the country that I know where I've encountered stiff opposition to body cameras. But I'm not going to allow myself to get distracted by that now, except to say that body cameras are an excellent mechanism for increasing civility on both sides and holding the police accountable for their actions. And that's really important. So Tom, can you move on to I want to give our perspective on the social justice protests here as we, before we go much deeper, because it has affected the city and the Bureau and the community in a big way. You know, we were hired for a specific purpose, as I just said, but with all the intense emotions and experiences around the protests, the shock, the anger, the fear, I do feel compelled to comment here and share our perspective. There's no question that systemic racial injustice is deep in our national history and clearly in Portland's history. I believe Oregon is the only state in the nation where the original Constitution prohibited Blacks from living there. And not everything's gone away. You know, I grew up in Portland. I have many stories I could tell. My immediate family today includes people of color, and I've been through a lot of experiences. I spent many years studying race prejudice and then race and policing and then police community relations. And, you know, honestly, the false rhetoric out of Washington, D.C. right now about the absence of bias in our society today is appalling and outrageous. So clearly, the community not only has a constitutional right to protest, but arguably a moral obligation to do so when the injustice is blatant and persistent. And as I said in our report, you know, civil disobedience and public demonstrations are designed to be painful and uncomfortable to those who don't see the problem. And John Lewis pointed that out very clearly. But I really also want to emphasize that criminal violence of any type, whether it's by the community or the police, is inexcusable and should not be tolerated. You know, setting fires and taking down historic statues and breaking windows and writing graffiti on government buildings and stealing property, even throwing dangerous objects at police officers, none of this should be tolerated. And many members of the community want the police to take firm action to enforce the law, believe it or not. And this is a safety issue, and this type of violence and destruction undermines the social order for everyone. So I must say the events in Portland are extraordinary, with white nationals coming to town and the persistent tensions between the far left and the far right. And with all this conflict, and then with the federal law enforcement coming there, the focus on local police reform, I think, can easily get lost. You know, enforcement tactics by the Portland Police Bureau must be applied with good cause and reasonableness, which hasn't always happened. We've seen some videos of police behavior that's disturbing. You know, honestly, after I'm getting old, and I've been working and studying the police for 40 years and watching them in more than 100 American cities. And you know, I'm not a cop hater, I'm not a cop lover, but I have pushed very hard for tangible reforms. And you know, I've observed really great cops, I've observed horrible cops, I've observed well-managed police organizations and very poorly managed police organizations. And you know, Portland is in a very unique situation today, and in a place that I haven't seen too many other departments. We've seen some in this year in the country, other places face these difficult situations. And I know many of you don't want me to say that, but clearly on the one hand, they're being criticized heavily. And it turns out by recent surveys, 4 in 10 Oregonians are claiming that police are not calling the violence and not being aggressive enough. And on the other hand, they're heavily criticized in Portland for being too aggressive and harming the community. And, you know, I can tell you, I certainly wouldn't want to be a cop today. It's a no-win situation. I don't know too many people want their children to grow up or to apply to be cops because it's such a difficult situation. So I do have some compassion, but they also have to follow the rules. And I'm sure if Portland Police Bureau could do it over again, they might have handled the protest differently. They certainly were caught off guard and had to learn a lot on the fly. But the only real question now is where we go from here. And I hope you will be part of that dialogue, which certainly will take you beyond the work that we've done. You know, in this third quarter report, we looked at the protests and the pandemic primarily as they affected PPB's ability to comply with the terms of the settlement agreement. Unfortunately, we found that PPB and the city failed to maintain substantial compliance during this maintenance year in terms of use of force and training. And we'll focus on those concerns tonight, although we'll cover all of the other areas. I don't know if you've gone on to the summary slide, summarizing the compliance.
Yes.
So there we still find the city and the Portland Police Bureau in substantial compliance in 5 of the 7 areas. That's community-based mental health services, crisis intervention, employee information systems, officer accountability, and community engagement and PSEP. We'll talk about each of those tonight briefly, but they did not, in our opinion and our judgment based on the available evidence, remain in substantial compliance in use of force and training. So let's go on and begin our discussion. I do want to say though, before we go on, you know, for even the areas that I just mentioned that we feel they still have remained in compliance, we're very cognizant of the fact that nothing's perfect and they have fallen down in some of the specific tasks in those areas, in part because of the highly unusual circumstances they've been facing. But overall, we were satisfied that most of their system objectives have been achieved or they're well down the road toward completing them. The 2 areas again where the problems are a little deeper are problematic, but I think they can also, some of those can be fixed in the near future. And we've recommended changes, and we will tonight as well. But you might want to ask, well, what does this non-compliance really mean? What happens next? I'm going to make a couple points here. This is our finding as the COCL. We're not the final decision maker, it turns out, in the way things are structured in Portland. That role belongs to the U.S. Department of Justice. And so DOJ has the final word on whether the city has fallen out of compliance. And, you know, in the past, they have used the evidence gathered by us, the COCL team, and some of our analysis of compliance. But I want to stress that they also conduct their own independent investigation and will reach their own conclusions. And if DOJ finds the city out of compliance, then there will be negotiations with the city about what happened, what does this mean, what has to be done exactly to restore substantial compliance, and what that time frame will be. I can't give you the answers to those because I don't know the answers at this moment in time. Their report is not in. It probably will be finished early in 2021, early January, but we don't know that for sure either. But we have our own views of what compliance looks like and evidence that we have, and we have recommendations as well for making things better. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom first, to talk about a few of the sections, and then I'll come back and talk more in a minute.
Sure, thank you, Chris. So looking at section 3, the use of force, we'll go through some of the paragraphs where we had found PPB and the city had maintained compliance before going into the paragraphs where we felt that they had fallen out of substantial compliance. So for one of the things, they're required to do a quarterly analysis of force. This is non-protest force. There's issues with doing comparison of protest force versus non-protest force for their quarterly analysis. What PPB does is at the annual, every year they do an annual analysis of protest force. So this is just non-protest force. But what we've seen is that the raw numbers of uses of force against individuals, the number of individuals who have had force used against them, it's consistent with prior trends, 169 in the second quarter. We do see an increase in the force to custody rate. The reason for this is because of COVID-19, there's been a decrease in interactions, a decrease in arrests. So while the raw number has generally stayed consistent, the number of overall interactions and arrests has decreased, and that's what would explain that increase to about 4.09%. Also in section 3, PPB is required to maintain a supervisor's checklist. They do that through the after action report, which you'll see me reference an AAR throughout this presentation. That's the after action report, and that's the supervisor when they're responding to the scene of a use of force and they're reviewing officers' force data collection reports or FDCRs. The supervisor then fills out a after action report to evaluate the use of force event. So they've maintained that checklist through the after action report. Additionally, they've maintained their the patrol supervision staffing level. Presently, they have about 4.84 officers per supervisor, excuse me, across the 3 main precincts. Finally, we conducted a review of 20 non-protest force cases to look at whether force is used, whether the force is documented comprehensively, whether it's reviewed comprehensively, and whether the force used was reasonable under the totality of the circumstances. In our review of those 20 non-protest force cases, covering category 2, category 3, and category 4 events, we did find that it was comprehensively documented, comprehensively reviewed, and reasonable under the totality of the circumstances. Where we had found that PPB and the city had fallen out of substantial compliance, one section is paragraph 66 through 69. This is the requirement of officers to complete timely force data collection reports, FDCRs, that have sufficient information for supervisors to conduct a thorough review. We were not provided sufficient documentation to assess these paragraphs. As the settlement agreement is set up, the burden of proof of maintaining compliance falls on the city and PPB, and we were not provided sufficient documentation. We were provided some FDCRs and AARs, but they weren't a sufficient representation of the protests. Because we didn't have that sufficient documentation, we were unable to determine the degree of whether sufficient information was found within the FDCRs. We were unable to determine whether the FDCRs were completed in a timely manner. And as well as we had found a use of force where an officer had struck a community member with a hard object in the head. This was not categorized as lethal force, and this goes to the reporting required under FDCRs. Another set of paragraphs in section 3 use of force are paragraph 70 and 73. Again, these are after action reports, the requirement for supervisors to complete after action reports. And again, we did not have sufficient documentation to be able to assess these paragraphs. Again, we were provided some after action reports, but not a sufficient representation of the protest events. Through our conversations with PPB, we also learned a couple of things: that during the early parts of the protests, there were some after action reports that contained over 100 FDCRs per after action. This means that one supervisor would be responsible for reviewing over 100 FDCRs. As you can probably guess, this has some implications for whether a supervisor can conduct a thorough review of those FDCRs when there's so many of them. We had also learned that during some of the early protest days, that after actions were not being completed within 72 hours. This has implications for recall. Interviewing an officer more than 72 hours later, it calls into question the reliability of what the officer can recall, particularly if that officer then is going through the same types of events, the same protests, night after night, and being able to remember details of that specific night and that specific use of force. When we are able to review a representative sample of the after action reports, we'll look to see for evidence of these things, but we have some initial concerns that a thorough review and recall might be impacted by the number of FDCRs and the timeline. We had also found that the city had not maintained substantial compliance with respect to paragraph 74, 75, and 77. These are paragraphs related to auditing of use of force cases. PPB has a extremely thorough audit, and because of the thoroughness of the audit, they were unable to provide the documentation of the after actions and of the FDCRs. The thoroughness of the audit caused these delays. We were informed in mid-August that no force events had gone through the full audit process because there's issues with identifying all the FDCRs that were a part of a force event, identifying all the after actions, making sure that all the information was gathered, and in the hecticness of the first few weeks of the protests, there was a lot of activity, and PPB was still trying to identify all the FDCRs and all of the after actions. And so what they did is in June, they decided to skip the force inspector reviewing protest force cases for the month of June, so that they can ensure that the third quarter protest force events, that there will be a comprehensive reporting for the third quarter. Skipping June, however, is a violation of the settlement agreement. And so that's one of the things that we had found them out of compliance for here. Because this impacts the ability of the force inspector to identify trends in a timely fashion, to be able to review the protest force events and identify trends that can be used to mitigate future uses of force or as a learning tool for the organization. Finally, one of the things that we had found was that for the overall force management, which we're required to evaluate under paragraph 170, is the management of force. One of the things that we had found was the totality of the protests overwhelmed PPB's ability to identify all force events that occurred. When we were asking for a reliable count of force by day, we were told that they would not be able to provide that. We were informed that they had some difficulty in locating and tracking all the FDCRs and after actions, particularly in the first week or two. had issues with timely after actions. And we were also able to identify videos that PPB had not sought out. And that really spoke to the management of the force, of being able to identify all uses of force events. That's not to say that PPB didn't take any steps. A lot of the steps that they did take were reasonable and likely can help better manage force in the future. But as Dr. Rosenbaum said, there was a lot of on-the-fly adjustments, and some of them were assigning a key case number so that each night of protests would have a specific key case number that officers could use to track. However, this was not consistently applied. You were able to link some. So for instance, the detectives division, they used a different case number as well as the key case number. You can link the two, but additional steps are needed. Another step that PPB took was assigning an after action sergeant for each squad for each night, as opposed to one sergeant reviewing all of the force reports in a single night. And finally, taking management steps to placing officers on administrative duty, officers that had used potentially problematic uses of force, identifying those officers and placing them on administrative duty. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Rosenbaum for training.
Mute myself. I gotta unmute myself, sorry. Can you hear me? Anybody?
Yes.
We could hear
Okay,
you.
great. In training, as we describe in our report, the Portland Police Bureau training was weakened by the COVID-19 pandemic, by the long-term protests against racial injustice, and by some administrative decision-making within the Bureau and the city. These factors resulted in changes to the training schedule and the content and the methods of delivery and the evaluation metrics. However, most of these training systems have continued to function and meet the sort of minimum standards for this settlement agreement, but some did not. And this slide here really says to you that we continue to apply the same evaluation standards that we've had in the past. And this is required by the settlement agreement. They must do a needs assessment. That's still in progress, and it'll probably have less impact on the training plan for 2021 because training for 2021 is heavily shaped by the need for makeup classes, which I'll talk about in a minute, not new classes that might be suggested if new training needs were identified. That's a whole nother issue. But we've argued that, for example, crowd management should be a priority along with communication skills for procedural justice and crisis intervention, that sort of thing. And I think that they'll do that. We've seen a preliminary plan. The evaluation systems, they're continuing those. They have some very talented people over there, but they're less extensive. Some of the metrics were lost when they did a quick conversion to online training in the middle of the year. The Portland Police Bureau hopes to recover some of that in 2021, but it's not a compliance issue for us because we think that they're going to get that in order, and they also have a pretty good system in place now. I'll come back to that though, what I think needs to be done. In terms of analysis and reporting of force data, PPB continues, the force inspector continues to look at that data, and the team there analyzes it, and they have given a presentation to the Training Advisory Council, or TAC, in July. PPB continues to document and report training. The documenting and reporting of it, that has continued through their learning management system, or LMS. And now in terms of delivering high quality training, let's move on to the next slide, because this is where we have encountered some problems. The in-service training, which is really the main backbone for most officers to get refresher training each year, was discontinued in March due to the pandemic. And at that point, I think about 55% of the officers had not received the skills refresher training. It's kind of a two-part thing. You get the classroom and then you get the hands-on skills training. That included use of force and de-escalation and procedural justice, skills that we consider essential for the proper management of crowds and protests, as well as daily operations in the field. The Bureau did not propose a makeup plan until late August. They did plan to restart some smaller classes during the summer to meet the requirement on social distancing set up by the governor, but that was quickly discarded when the protest started. In fact, the Police Bureau pretty much emptied out the training academy and put nearly everyone on the front lines of the protests. And so in a nutshell, the required 2020 in-service training will not be delivered to the majority of the police force in 2020, but in 2021. I credit them. They introduced some online videos to cover the classroom portion for the officers, but 55% were left without the skills portion of in-service, including 485 officers who didn't get their state required 8 hours of training in use of force. So Tom, let's go on to the next slide on remedial action that we feel is needed. I think, so the Bureau needs to provide more details in a training plan to ensure that the skills classes that were missed in 2020 are included in the 2021 in-service training. Here we need to know that the Bureau is committed to restoring the original in-service training that we observed and that we approved way back in February and March. So they do have the ability to do this. There's no question about that. We need to know that all officers will receive refresher training, not only in use of force, but de-escalation, procedural justice, and crowd management. These makeup plans, there is a makeup plan that they put together. It was a good start, but it just lacks some of these details. And more specifically, details about the methods of training as well, and not just the classes that are going to be offered, and how they'll be integrated and evaluated. We want to see lesson plans and know that meaningful scenarios will be introduced that are helpful for acquiring particular communication skills. We want to know how many hours will be devoted to each session and how officers will be evaluated in debriefing sessions. So Portland Police Bureau is trying to catch up what they felt they couldn't do in 2020 and loaded into the 2021 in-service training that starts in January, I believe. I guess I also point out that there is a significant time gap between the officers getting their classroom presentation of the material in the first half of 2020 and then receiving the skills training on these topics in the first half of 2021. So roughly a year later. So I think PPB needs to give some type of brief refresher on the knowledge component before they jump into the skills component. But I don't want to bore you with it down in the weeds here. So, but we have specific recommendations there. Tom, if we can go on to the training challenges that remain. I just described the first one here, figuring out how to link knowledge, which comes through these classroom videos and lectures, to practice, which is in-person skills training. Something needs to be done to link the two given the time gap that exists. And then expanding the virtual training from videos to interactive adult learning. The videos they used were a good start. They were just videos of the training that occurred in January and February. But the Bureau must catch up, with what we see going on nationwide. High schools and colleges around the country now, in this COVID-19 world, they're all providing real interactive learning using platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams like we're doing tonight. And so this is a big challenge that requires a lot of time and IT resources. And, but my argument is that just watching videos isn't adequate, and they need to create interactions between students and instructors, which is really essential for acquiring and retaining certain types of knowledge and skill sets, based on my experience. And then introducing surveys and tests to evaluate the virtual training. You know, PPB has some really good surveys that we even help them refine them and develop them early on. And these metrics need to be adapted to the virtual world so that the Bureau can immediately provide feedback on some virtual, you know, why some of the virtual instructors are doing really well and why others are not. And that type of evaluation system they had in the past prior to 2020. I hope they can do that. But as my last point here indicates, locating the funding necessary to achieve these goals is difficult. This is the biggest challenge, especially in light of the budget cuts that are related to the virus and cuts related to the protests and the defund police movement. You know, the police division should not be funded so heavily, in my opinion, by overtime budget, which has been cut, and they're experiencing more cuts. And if they do, I think the important thing is they have to have a workforce that's properly trained for a very difficult job. And I think it should be a priority.
Dennis, I don't want to cut you
yeah.
off, but I'm just aware of the time. So hopefully
Sure.
we could get to the public comment at some point soon.
Sure. This is a 2-hour meeting, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right. We'll speed it up a bit. You know, I don't want to get in the middle of this heated debate about defunding the police. We certainly support re-envisioning the police function and exploring alternative ways to deliver certain services that are currently handled by the police. But in our report, we also point out that PPB already has one of the smallest budgets in the country relative to other 49 largest cities. They have the second smallest budget when you look at the, and the officer to population ratio doesn't show that Portland's over police. They only rank 329th out of 634 cities. We do point out that the paragraph 7 requires the city to fund the police adequately to achieve compliance. The COCL, we just want training to be a priority. Okay, Tom, I think, are you up next? Or is that me?
No, that's me.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. For some of these sections, I think we can go through them fairly quickly because we've seen the maintenance of compliance similar to prior quarters. So for instance, with Section 5, community-based mental health services, we continue to find that the city and PPB play an active role in community-based mental health services, as evidenced by the BHUAC, which is the Behavioral Health Unit Advisory Committee, the Behavioral Health Coordination Team, the Unity Transportation Work Group, Oregon Behavioral Health Collaborative, and the Legacy ED Community Outreach Group. Additionally, we continue to find that the Unity Center operates in accordance with the Memphis model of a crisis response system, and it mitigates the potential for criminalization as well as reduces resource burden on PPB. With crisis intervention, with BOAC, the Bureau of Emergency Communications, the policies continue to remain in effect of when to dispatch an ECIT officer. BOAC continues to provide a 16-hour CIT training for all new employees and telecommunicators, as well as in the past they had provided in-service training. Obviously this year COVID has impacted this as well as the protests. They've conducted alternate training approaches, and we've been in communication with them about when in-service might start up again. But they've obviously been impacted by the pandemic and the protests. With PPB, all officers continue to receive 40 hours of CIT prior to graduating the Advanced Academy. This year, classes were conducted via Zoom for the classroom portion, as well as in-person scenarios and debriefings. The annual in-service, as Dr. Rosenbaum alluded to, has been impacted by COVID and the protests. However, One of the things that we've recently learned is PPB is putting together a in-service training for all officers that will relate to crisis intervention. Additionally, PPB has recently put on a supervisors academy. I went to the third week of it last week in Portland, and it contained an ECIT as a street level resource for supervisors class, which was well done, and it reinforced the importance of ECIT as an important resource. ECIT officers, they receive 40 additional hours on top of the 40 hours that all officers receive. PPB, the last class that they put forth was in November, and a new ECIT class. Consistent with the settlement agreement, they retain their normal patrol duties, and there's certain selection and retention criteria for being an ECIT officer. PPB has continued with their mental health template, which is a data collection tool and allows PPB to evaluate the ECIT program through a quarterly evaluation of some metrics, as well as a more comprehensive semi-annual evaluation. We've also noted some qualitative outcomes. I think a lot of Portland community members are familiar with the officer involved shooting involving an individual in crisis holding 2 knives. One of the things that I'm not sure that all Portland community members are aware of are between April 15th and May 7th, there were 3 interactions, very similar situations with persons holding knives. All of them were de-escalated without the use of lethal force. So again, just as something, and this is something that PPB has put, they're required to highlight the successes of ECIT, and at least one of these interactions was in their quarterly newsletter.
Tom, I'm just going to interrupt here. I want to know how much more time, because community members are asking, and we're 45 minutes in. And
So,
I think,
excuse me, I'm sorry. I really appreciate them giving the information. So what's on the agenda?
this is on the agenda, but community people want to have time to ask questions. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how much longer the presentation will go.
I just wanted to mention that while there are community members that have read through the entirety of the document, there are members of the community on this call that have not read through the entirety of this document. So we have to be inclusive of all folks in this meeting. There will be over an hour, I assume, of time for community and PSEP comment. But I think it is important that we allow COCL to respectfully to get through this.
Tom, I think we should be able to finish this up in the next 10 or 15 minutes at most, right?
I believe so. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So also part of the crisis intervention section is the behavioral health response team. There's 5 teams within Portland. Each precinct has a team, as well as a team for the houseless population and a team with follow-up for BHRT clients. Acceptance rates continue to be approximately 50%, 45 and 55%. But again, just maintaining the compliance that they had, that we had found them in for the past, couple of years. Same thing with the service coordination team, which facilitates the provision of services to persons who are chronically houseless, suffer chronic addiction, and are chronically involved with the criminal justice system. We've conducted analysis showing positive impact on employment and police contacts. There's a Portland State University annual capstone study class that has found lower costs to the county. We're still waiting for the most recent report, but we anticipate it will likely be positive as well. The number of SCT individuals that were referred for this last quarter shows a bit low. However, again, that's related to COVID. Finally, as it relates to the crisis intervention section, we look at the Behavioral Health Unit Advisory Committee, which is an advisory body to PPB about mental health response. They went through a number of topics in the second quarter. we list all of these in our report. But one of the things that we feel is a positive step is that members continue to participate in the PSEP's Behavioral Health Subcommittee meetings. The employee information system, again, we find that they've maintained compliance with uploading data, with alerts when somebody triggers one of the thresholds that's listed in the settlement agreement as requiring EIS alert, and getting the right alerts to supervisors. I'll just go through this real quick. The interventions, and so an intervention might be a discussion with the officer, it might be a referral to training, it might be a 30, 60-day monitoring. But what we've seen is that the interventions for this second quarter was about 90% of the alerts that were sent to the supervisor, 90% received some type of intervention. So obviously the supervisors are feeling that there's something there, and they're conducting the interventions with the officers. EIS also requires a review of an officer's EIS history. What we saw in this quarter was a sharp decline in the new to command reviews. PPB had also identified this trend before we had identified the trend though. And they had sent a bureau-wide memo out to all PPB members to say, if you are changing your position, or if you are receiving somebody, if somebody new is coming under your command, you have to do these reviews to all the subordinates. So while we do see a decline here, we did see that PPB self-identified and self-initiated a remedial action. And so we'll look to see whether that corrects itself in the future. This was the section that I really want to take a little bit of time on, the accountability. The protest events doubled the number of contacts and complaints that came into IPR. So in June and July, out of 336 total contacts, 165 related to the protests. That's 49.1%. Again, had these protests not occurred, IPR's contacts and complaints would not have increased the way that they did. And it's an important point that I want to get to. So for instance, in June, 77 administrative investigations were opened. The average since May of 2019 was 35.6 per month. So again, this doubling of work. 2 IPR investigators are currently handling the same volume of administrative investigations as the entire IPR handled 1 year ago. So all of this is under access. We found that PPB and IPR have maintained their access to be able to file a complaint, and obviously because people have been. But it's because of this volume, it's because of the number of contacts and complaints that have come in that this has impacted expediency. Being able to deal with stages of investigations in a timely manner. So IPR has decreased in their ability to meet stage timelines, particularly with intake investigations. And this chart shows you, these are for all stages. The blue line is for IA within PPB, and the orange line is for IPR. So we've seen in June and July, the number of cases that met their stage timelines has decreased. There's a couple of reasons for this though. First of all, complainants are not always engaging with IPR. So when IPR is trying to, conduct the intake investigation and make an informed decision as to whether to put it forth for a full administrative investigation, they need to be able to talk with complainants. When they're not able to talk with them, it takes the time to then identify other ways to engage with them or to make the decision. Additionally, officer identity is not always known. If you get an incident where you have a number of officers using less lethal weapons, and a community member complains that they were hit with one of those less lethal weapons, IPR has to be able to identify those officers. But in a large group of officers, it's not always the easiest to identify which specific officer hit them with the less lethal. And finally, just this is the sheer volume. has impacted their ability to expediently resolve these cases. IPR has taken a number of steps to increase their expediency, including meetings to allow for PPB officers to self-identify, keeping the person of the day the same to keep everything consistent, having a single point of contact for document requests, referring cases to IA, and enhancing their case management. However, one of the things that we've been informed is at some point they'll reach, if they haven't already, will reach a point of saturation where all of these efforts there won't be any increased efficiency. Our total evaluation will depend on the 180-day assessment, though, because that's what paragraph 121 says, is that the complete case will be completed in 180 days. We still find that the accountability system is largely transparent. You can track your cases. That's largely consistent between IA and IPR. We just observed a joint training between IA and IPR, a refresher training. And that the system of checks and balances that are found within the accountability system remain. And finally, there was accountability section has a section about OIS events, officer involved shooting events. There was one in the second quarter. All of the things that would be required under an OIS were followed: separation of witness involved officers, walkthrough, CROs, and all of the things that are in the settlement agreement. Finally, we make one comment about the ballot measure that will be upcoming in November. So long as the final construction of the proposed board is in line with the settlement agreement, we take no position on it. However, paragraph 4 does say that any new board would still have to comply with the settlement agreement. And then Dennis, I'll hand it over to you for community engagement.
Okay, thanks, Tom. This is section 9. I'm going to wrap this up before the top of the hour. That's my goal. Community engagement and the PSEP role. The good news is I don't have to tell you what you folks are already doing, but you've continued to support, multiple subcommittees and seeking input from the community and government. You continue to meet monthly. You continue to host listening sessions. You've continued to pass multiple recommendations. I've heard, though, that some of the recommendations, there's concern about the timeliness of feedback from the city, so we can talk about that if you want to bring that up later. I don't want to, I could respond to it, but I don't want to take the time right now. I think that's an issue. In general, though, our impression is that the PSEP has a good working relationship with the police bureau and the mayor's office, and the city continues to do its job in terms of supporting the PSEP with membership and training and staffing and technical assistance with meetings. So in sum, I think that I feel strongly that the PSEP continues to function as a legitimate body for community engagement with city support. So if we can go on to the next slide, Tom, in terms of PPB's role, there's no question that they've continued to engage community in different strategies. It's been altered because of the pandemic and the protests, but especially their community engagement division has continued to very creatively engage different communities throughout the city. And moving to a virtual platform, they've established these partnerships with organizations from very diverse parts of Portland and shared information about the Bureau and its performance statistics. It's maintained and supported relationships with a half a dozen advisory councils. They're all on the website, including PSEP and the Training Advisory Council. The Bureau has been fully transparent in the provision of quarterly and annual reports on traffic stops and use of force, with breakdowns by race and gender, and made that data available to TAC as well for reanalysis. And as we've described in the report, they've made significant progress toward implementing the 4 key components of the community engagement plan. And so we find the city and PPB has maintained compliance with Section 9 on community engagement. Now, the challenges ahead, Tom, if you can move to the next slide. At this moment in history, let's not be naive that the relationships are strained by the protests. Clearly, there have been challenges on both sides of the fence when it comes to building trust. Inside the Bureau, officers are exhausted physically and mentally and demoralized by protests directed at them. And outside, the protesters have expressed their anger and distrust of the police and frustration with city government, and you know, my point is consistent community-oriented leadership in the Bureau as well is needed to build strong and lasting partnerships. Yet PPB has experienced 6 police chiefs over the last 6 years, and I hope the city helps to stabilize that in the future. So despite these constraints though, you know, I have to say I'm impressed with the many partnerships and advisory councils that have been created over the last few years, and the willingness of these community members to volunteer their time and be part of this reform movement, even in the face of uncertainty, you know, about where this is all going to end up and how we're going to get there. So thank you. I'm going to stop there and we'll open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you. Tom, if you could stop sharing the screen. We can get back to everyone. Okay, so we are almost at the top of the hour, but I will just open it up and then pass it on to Lakiana. We thought since the public, really this is a town hall for the public, that we would give the public first an opportunity to ask questions, and then we would take PSEP comment after that. So if you could use your raise hand function. I see Vadim there, but we will start with Susan.
Hello, my name is Susan Cotter. Dr. Rosenbaum, I use she, her pronouns, and I live, as opposed to you, in Portland. You place a lot of emphasis on the budget compared to other cities, but we all know that there are significant nuances in the budget, and only 10% of our budget is actually discretionary budget, which is where the police funding goes to. So we have 35% of our discretionary budget spent on PPB, and the non-discretionary budget has a lot to do with capital expenditures and lots of other things. So it sounds like what you're doing is comparing us to other cities that don't have similar budget structures. And I had sent this note ahead of time asking, and I really feel like the statistic that you used is deceptive because of that. And my note to you ahead of time, to give you a chance to respond thoughtfully, is what valid budget statistic can we use to compare with similar cities?
Well, thank you, Susan. First of all, does my mute off? I guess it is. Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, it's not my statistics. And I think, you know, it's important to point out this was done by the 24/7 Wall Street researchers at USA Today.
Oh, I meant in your report. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but in the report where I refer to the fact that the Portland budget is only 4.4% of the total budget, that's the operating budget. I'm using their statistics where they standardize the comparison across these 50 large cities. So the reality is that Portland ranks 49th out of 50 when you compare their budget to the total. And if you're coming up with some other concept of discretionary money, I would prefer that that be explained. I mean, I'm confident that these folks used pretty common standards across the different 50 cities.
So tell me again who these folks are.
Well, it's in the article, I actually provided the link to the article.
Yeah, if you don't mind just repeating the source.
So it's a group, and they call themselves the 24/7 Wall Street group, and their report appeared in USA Today. And they list every single city and the details of the data that they have. So, you know, I don't want to, we could have a long debate. We don't have a lot of time tonight about budgets. I mean, you're arguing that the Portland Police Bureau takes up 35% of some discretionary budget.
Yes.
I don't know how that compares with other cities. I don't know what that means. I'm just saying when you use standard metrics across cities, they rank very low in terms of how much of the city budget they use up.
Well, and I doubt your statistic. I mean, because
not my statistic. Be clear,
it's not my statistic. It's your statistic that you are quoting.
Okay, Susan, I think there are different ways to look at statistics. I think the report represents one statistic. I've seen, as Susan mentioned, there's other ways to look at it. I don't know how that also compares across cities. So that's something hopefully we could look at. Next up is Portland Cop Watch.
Oh, hi, Dan Handelman with Portland Cop Watch. I use he, him pronouns. And I want to start out by thanking this compliance team for calling out the city and the Bureau for missing their compliance in those two areas that you have identified already, and probably they will be out of compliance with accountability as well. And especially for calling out that one incident where the officer clearly in the video deliberately walks up to a woman and hits her in the head with a baton, and that the IPR called that a push, and that the Bureau called it an accident is, you know, an outrage after all these years that we've been trying to have reform and transparency and openness about what's going on. It's just an outrage that those terms are being used by the agencies that are supposed to be holding these officers accountable. So I appreciate that you did that and that you continue to talk about the importance of the social justice movement that is present here and around the country. That said, I continue to be concerned about kind of the dividing line that you just described in words tonight about, you know, talking about mostly property damage being done by community members, whereas the police are actually beating people on the head and using less lethal weapons, so-called, against them, and using chemical agents, whether or not it's tear gas. That is violence, okay? It's debatable whether or not when you harm a piece of an inanimate object, if that's violence or not. And I say it's not. So that article about the focus on the budget that Ms. Cotter brought up, it is that same article says that we spend the 31st most out of the top 50 cities just in raw numbers of how much money we spend. So the fact that you've latched on to this second least percentage of our overall budget, some cities include their school districts in their city budgets, and we don't. So it's just, there are very many different factors. And as a social scientist and somebody who does statistics, you should have looked into that more and maybe done a per capita expense or something to see where we rate on that. Right now, we're in a debate where the community is demanding that the police cut more of their funds. And there are several places in this report where you ask for more money to be spent on the police. And when you're talking about the overload of the IPR, you do not suggest that we take some of the investigator money that's going to the internal affairs and give it to IPR instead. So instead of suggesting such a thing, you know, the IPR turned over 1/4 of the use of force cases at the protests for internal affairs to investigate. And that's why the public wants to have an independent police oversight system so that the police aren't investigating other police. And it's exactly why there's a ballot measure about that right now, because people do not want to see that continue. And you know, there's a bunch of other stuff that I want to talk about, but I guess I'll try to quickly just say that you know, you raised the question about whether or not it was appropriate for them to take the officers out of the training division and send them out to the front lines, quote unquote, of the protests. And you said, of course, you need officers on the front line. But the deployment question is part of the overall question about everything that you've raised. If the Portland police did not send so many officers out, and those officers did not engage in so much violence, they wouldn't have such a backlog of cases that they had to report on. The supervisor wouldn't have that many cases that they had to review for the after action reports. And there'd be plenty of officers in the training division to keep training the other officers what they're doing. So this is all political decisions that were made by either the police themselves or by the political leadership to send officers out onto the streets and use this violence against protesters to try to stop the movement from doing what it's doing. And so I think you really have to examine that, and especially, again, as a social scientist who's looking at what is causing these backlogs, these are decisions that they're making that aren't necessarily appropriate. So if there's more time later, I'll try to raise my hand again, but thank you.
You want me to quickly respond to that,
Yes,
Elliot?
please.
Well, thank you, Dan. You always bring up a number of good points. On your last point there about taking people out of the training academy, we described that factually. I tried not to take too strong of a stand. I certainly did not say it was a good decision. And I implied that there were problems. It was a management decision. You didn't have to take everybody. You could have taken a good chunk of people without doing that. And I think that it's very possible that the strategy of how do you respond to protests, it's very possible that showing less force and less numbers would have had fewer problems. So I'm not going to challenge you on that. I don't want to relive this budget thing again, except to say that I have some faith that these researchers controlled for whether the schools were part of your budget and all of that. I mean, we can check that more. I don't want to rely on that, but they did provide other statistics. For example, how the number of law enforcement employees per 100,000 of the population. So at least there's some standardized data there. Portland ranks 180, has 180 per 100,000, which ranks them 329th out of 634. So they're not like there's not 1 million police there per population in Portland. So not saying that you can't rethink the budget. I'm fine with that. I'm just saying our job was to say, I don't think that the training was, had enough people, and their IT program needs to be beefed up as well. But anyway.
Okay,
Back
thanks.
to, is there other questions? He brought up a number. Thank you for, we did call it out what we saw, and and I hear what you're saying about the police response as well. And maybe there's violence on both sides. We did call that out in that one example that we did not feel was unintentional, as the officer said it was.
Thanks, Dennis. I'm going to pass it over to Lakiana now to continue the facilitation.
Thanks, Elliot. Dr. Rosenbaum, were you done with that point that you're making?
Yeah, no, go ahead. That's fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so let's continue on with community member comments. If you can just raise your hands in the chat box or in the participant box, and we will call on you.
I think Zainab has been there.
Oh, my bad. I'm scrolled way down to the bottom. Yeah, go ahead, Zainab.
Thank you. And I appreciate you being able to share the report too. I wasn't able to read the entire report yet. I was actually on which page? I was trying to wonder why it skipped from, it said section 3. So what happened to section 1 and 2? That's what I was looking for. And perhaps I just missed how it was printed. I was thinking the same comments that Susan in CopWatch is talking about when it comes to the budget, and then the number of cops. You had 485 who did not receive training out of how many? And so that was like, if I own like how many, if that's like 100% of them, or that was a percentage. And I know you said 55%, but so is that 55% of the 485? Did that number go with that number?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. Yeah, there's over 900 officers, I think. I don't have the exact number. 922 is the number I have in front of me, but there may be people that are missing from that. So it's over half the police force, yeah. And go ahead, I don't want to interrupt you.
And so, and I got the question about but that's the first thing I thought about was, when you're not given the right tools, and resources and funding is one of those things. And I'm not going into a debate about defunding or, police or not. What I'm really saying about when you're getting training and that they put people out there without the proper training, even the basic training. And so with your report that you provided, and this is your third report, so I didn't see the other 2 reports. Was it consistent with what you have seen in other reports? And I'm asking that to other people who have been here with PSEP, if this is the same information that you received or is different.
Same information in terms of what, like same style report, or like?
No. In regards to, if like you notice how you talked about that they didn't get trained. So were they not training the other, like the other two reports that you provided, were they training their staff then? Like was their people
Yes.
trained?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can respond to that. Yes, this is the first year. And the debate is about whether there was any, some people argue that there's absolutely nothing they could have done. And this is the first year because of the pandemic and the protests, and it's all like a perfect storm. We chose to argue that there were things that could have been done. And but that we do acknowledge and admit that we think that the more we looked at it, that the training division is not adequately funded. It's something we didn't really look at before much because they were able to get most of it done, but they've gradually lost position. So I'm not saying where the money should come from or whether it should come from another division or the city should provide it. And I'm not saying it's possible that they could put together a compliance plan without the extra money for training. They won't necessarily do state-of-the-art stuff with IT, virtual stuff, because that is going to require more work. But anyway, we're just pointing out that it didn't happen. The training looks like money is one of the factors. They used a lot of their overtime money to fill in positions, to have instructors come off the street, and then they have to hire officers to fill those in. And,
Then in regards to your COCL, and I'm not sure with PSEP, in regards to the COCL, and is someone there to assess it personally, or are you just going by reports?
No, we've been there ourselves, and we were there quite a bit earlier in the year, and then Tom was just recently out there. We also have people on the ground in Portland, one person that lives there.
Right.
Sorry, can I clarify one thing? I just want to say that the officers have received training on crowd control. They have received training on use of force. The training that was missed this year was refresher training, particularly with their crowd control training. This was an important refresher training that wasn't delivered. But it's not like that PPB officers have never received training on these things before. This was just the annual refresher training as required by the settlement agreement.
And if you're new, how many of those officers were new? That's the question.
Well, the new officers did get their training. That's a special academy for them. And it's taken a while, but they've gotten most of them have been trained.
All right, thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you.
So next up we have Barb, then we're going to go back to Debbie and then back to Susan. Barb, do you want me to read your question or do you want to give it yourself?
Sorry, I didn't have my tech support ready because I wasn't ready to go.
That's okay.
That's okay. The one I put in the chat was more or less directed at Mary Claire or anybody that knows. This is the first of a couple questions. What is the cop population for Portland PBB right now, given who are like, I'm going to say fully trained, as in maybe not refresher trained, but not the new recruits, based on losing a bunch of people in August?
Oh, tired.
Mary Claire, are you able to speak to that? Or anybody else from PPB that's on?
Oh, terrible support.
No, here she is.
Oh, sorry. I just had to find the mute button. Sorry.
Yeah, it's the hardest part.
I hear that.
Go ahead, Mary Claire.
I am sorry. I do not have the number off the top of my head, but I can certainly get it for you.
I would really appreciate that. I think it would help us have a clearer picture of what they're dealing with and what's going on.
I heard that from the chief that the number was something around 50 officers that retired in August.
Yes. Yes, I know it was I know,
Yeah.
right. I'm with you on that. And then there were supposedly some
5 leaves.
resignations also, but I also saw somebody put a link to something in the chat, so I will check that out. I'm wondering if the city or the police department or IPR, whoever would have been in charge of checking with the DOJ or the COCL, etc., about the decision to skip June. Was that, I mean, did they reach out, or was that just like a unilateral thing? And then, yeah, I'm not going to ask. The other one is sort of like, how do you see stuff in the next like 2 or 3 years? But I don't think that one's fair.
I think that's a good question to throw in there. I think they can take a stab at that.
Okay.
And also the other, let's start with the other one that you had though around the decision to skip June. And just for my recollection, can you, because I saw it in the report, what did they skip in June again?
They skipped the audit of the of protest force events, and so you've been with us for a while on this, Lakiana. So the audit has phase 1 and phase 2. The phase 2 is the force inspector reviewing the use of force cases to identify potential training implications, policy implications, personnel, equipment, and so those are the cases that for the month of June, they were going to be skipping. And the reason provided was so that to be able to...
Does that count more or less comfortable with the question?
Amy, you're on your phone, your speaker's not off. If you can mute it, please. Thank you.
But the reason provided to us was in order to be able to have Q3 completely done, was to skip June, and as they catch up, as they're able to get back on track with Q3 and get back on track with Q4, being able to make up those June cases as well. But as we said in our report, the concern with that is then the force inspector being able to identify timely trends that could be provided to the policy division or the training division. And so that was our concern with that. But the rationale was to be able to then grab Q3 and grab Q4 and be able to fully do those quarters.
But that was my question. My
Sure.
question was, did they consult outside before they made that decision?
I think Mary Claire was going to.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Yes. I did speak to both COCL and DOJ when before making that decision. You should understand, number one, it's not an audit of the thing, it's a count. The audit for crowd control is only done once a year, as Tom mentioned earlier. And I think it's also important to note that we were late only on the crowd control pieces of force. The regular force, the day-to-day, so to speak, force reporting was done in a timely fashion and was included in the second quarter report as required. The only piece of this was when in counting the uses of force for the month of June, because there was so much activity at, when this first began, the end of May, the beginning of June. So we knew that we would be out of compliance for that piece, or could be charged with being out of compliance for that piece. So I made the decision, rather than continuing that and being late on the third quarter and then the fourth quarter, because it would snowball, to stop the count of June and get current with the third quarter, which is July, August, and September, so that the November report will have all the information that's required for the settlement agreement in terms of the uses of force.
Mary Claire, thank you very much for saying all of that. I'm not sure that if you read the chat, or I would have put it in there for you, but thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then I had another question though, right?
Yep, go ahead, Barb.
Oh, it was where do you see yourselves, what role do you see yourselves playing a year from now, 2 years from now, etc.?
Are you talking to the COCL or?
I am.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to even think that far ahead. I mean, frankly, I was hoping this would be over, but it's not. And I do care about Portland, but we're going to have to wait for DOJ to, they're the leader in this thing, and they have to decide where Portland is out of compliance, or if they're not at all. They may feel that somehow in this last quarter, and I know Portland's trying to do that they've managed to fill these gaps and come up with good plans for filling them. And they may decide that while we respect COCL, we don't agree with them. And we think that they're in full compliance and this thing's over. It would be over January 10th or something. So if not, it could drag out next year. And these areas that we have concern in training and accountability and what's the other one, Tom? I'm blanking on it.
Use of force.
Use of force, excuse me. It's late here in Chicago. So I really can't, Barb, answer your question fully. We're always available to help. I mean, we've given a lot of technical assistance over the last 5 years, and Portland's been pretty open to that. And again, I don't feel it's I have certain petty things that drive me nuts, like body-worn cameras, but other than that, I mean, we'll be helpful if we can. But we're not scheduled to do anything next year unless this is extended. So.
Thank you. We're going to keep things rolling. Just to let folks know, we really want to prioritize the community, knowing that PSEP members do have access to COCL offline and at other times. So we'll go to probably around 7:45 for community questions, and then leave just some space at the end for a couple PSEP questions. But next up on the queue, we have Debbie, then we'll go to Susan, excuse me, and then back to Dan with Portland Cop Watch. Go ahead,
Hi,
Debbie.
this is Debbie Iona. First, I want to say how much I appreciated that we did get the presentation tonight. I find those very helpful. And then wondered, my question for Dr. Rosenbaum is if he's had a chance to look at the OIR group's latest report, and if he has any comments on the length of time those investigations took that were captured in that report, and to what extent does he end up using the information in those reports in these quarterly reports. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Debbie. I've been pretty stressed out lately with a lot of work. I have not looked at the latest report other than to read the summary. We have incorporated their work in the past and used it, and I think they do good work, and I don't have a problem with it. And Tom, I don't know if you've had a chance to.
Yeah, I've had a chance to review it throughout the entire report. Again, OIR group they're an independent group. They conduct their own. They do a very thorough job of diving deep into officer-involved shooting events and lethal force events. Their task, though, is somewhat different from our task. They are very broad in their approach by design. Our task is constricted by what the settlement agreement asks us to assess. So while we do read them and we learn from them and we envelop them into our understanding of Portland, again, it has to be remembered that their task is much broader with respect to OIS events and officer and lethal force events than the task that's required by us of the settlement agreement.
Well, and I guess the thing that I found most notable related to your work was the length of time the investigations took to complete. I mean, they were way beyond, some of them were way beyond 180 days. And I'm curious if you have any comments about that. I mean, they said a lot of it just had to do with stuff sitting on people's desk for, you know, a couple months without any action being taken.
Sure, and one of the things I'd have to go back to their report and see where they are calling the end point, whether they're including the grand jury. I don't remember you know, looking at that particularly, but one of the things that we do with the accountability system and the 180-day timeline is we look at the overall trends. And we do understand, and we've said this in a number of reports, that there are particular cases that will take over 180 days. And if it's reasonable that they do, if it's a matter of, you know, like you're saying, things are sitting on people's desks, if that's the cause of it going over 180 days, then that's not reasonable. But we also do look at the overall trends. And one of the things that we had seen was 94%, I believe, 2 quarters ago, 94% were completed within the 180-day timeline. I believe I can't remember what it was the last quarter, but we do look at those 180-day timelines from a trend perspective, with the understanding that particularly with officer-involved shooting and lethal force events, those taking a time over 180 days, that those might be a bit more reasonable than a more common administrative investigation.
And the protests have changed the whole ballgame because those are.
All of these were from before protests or the
Right.
coronavirus and everything. I mean, because, you know, they're always kind of behind. So,
Right.
okay.
And,
well, thank you for your answer.
well, and to that point, you know, Debbie, you're absolutely right. Some of them were 2 or 3 years ago. And what we saw was it was approximately, you know, 3 quarters ago that we had seen the cases much more consistently being done in 180 days. So you might be right in that those are relics from prior to when they were in substantial compliance with paragraph 121.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Next, before you get to the next speaker, I'm actually going to have Jared Hager from the Department of Justice, who wanted to just comment on a previous question in regards to the decision to skip the June audit and the Department of Justice's standpoint on it. Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, Lakiana. And this is in response to Barb's question about the notice and whether or not the Bureau, I forgot if you asked it in terms of told us in advance or sought our permission. We don't give permission or things like that. And I did want to make clear that, you know, Mary Claire has been in contact with us and the compliance officer about their plans and the shortcomings and where they had difficulty. But I do want to underscore that the department didn't agree to any amendment of the terms to, you know, vary reports that might have been due. We're in the middle of collecting our evidence and putting together our report, and we expect that to be done in December with probably an early January filing date, and we'll give more information on that. But I did want to make clear that we, you know, to amend the agreement takes a, you know, an act of City Council, and it's got to go up the chain of the Department of Justice, and there was no amendment with respect to the audits that might have been required by the settlement agreement in June. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. Let's go next to Susan.
Hi, this is Susan Cotter again. On page 5 of your document that you sent out, the draft document, it talks about your feeling that the processes that were in place for mental health crisis, which is your little tiny skinny spaghetti lane, would be appropriate to handle equity, other equity concerns throughout Portland. And PPB is an anti-democratic organization whose systems in no way will address inequities. And PPB's inequities to transfer the recording keeping skills, which they're already having trouble with their recording keeping skills in this little spaghetti lane of mental health crises. And you say that they can function this, in another lane, and there's no evidence that shows that. And it really, what it does is it indicates that they're more box checkers rather than are implementing any kind of real improvement. And it's really not even professionalism. And it feels like your expensive reporting, we're going through all these details, feels like moving deck chairs on the Titanic. It feels like what you're saying just doesn't meet what we're experiencing as a community. And it makes me not trust what you're saying, or that you can impact any change whatsoever, and that you're worth the $300,000 a year we pay for you.
Want me to respond to that?
Yeah, feel free to.
I do.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I know the money thing comes up all the time. And if you do your analysis, you'll see that we, of all the active consent decrees and settlement agreements around the country, we make about 1/5 of the average size of other. So it's not, we have a lot of people doing things.
It's about value.
Okay, we can talk about value. I mean, I hope that you've read all of our reports from 2015 on, so that you can see that we were very critical, but Portland Police Bureau has established a lot of the systems that were required of them. And we are not into box checking. We've been fighting that from day one. That's why training, they could have said we did X, Y, and Z in training, and I kept saying, no, you haven't. That's not good enough. Go back to the drawing board. We've said that in their evaluations of training. No, it's not good enough. We made them develop a very detailed system, for example, just to evaluate the training instructor, the content of the training, the impact, the knowledge that the students had to walk away with. So, I mean, I could spend the whole night talking to you for hours. I'm sorry you don't believe in us, but now you maybe raise another question. Do we really know that all these systems that were put in place, that were not just box checking, do we know that they've made a difference? And we've looked at some outcomes, and we've looked at force, and it's very hard without doing randomized controlled trials, which I'm an enormous fan of. By the way, I'm a fellow in the Academy of Experimental Criminology, and we only promote randomized trials. We haven't done those in Portland. It's hard to definitively prove cause and effect, but I do believe Portland is better off than it was. I think that a lot of this dialogue around the country now about you need a policy on this and you need a policy on that. Well, Portland's done a lot of that. Did it make a difference in behavior? I wish there was more metrics out in the field about contact surveys and things like that. We did some of that stuff, but I think the burden is on the community and on the police department, the Bureau, to continue to collect statistics that don't just deal with mental health, but that was our focus. I know you call it a tiny little area, but it's really important to a lot of people.
Oh, it is important to everyone. That's the point.
Susan,
it's a whole big pot of spaghetti.
Susan, can we allow him to finish his thoughts, and then we'll come
I'm
back?
so sorry. Please forgive me.
No, that's okay. But I do think we're in a time where, as I said earlier, that we've neglected the disparities in treatment by race and ethnicity that have dominated policing for so long. And I think that there's still room for improvement there, but it wasn't the central focus of this, I'm sorry to say, but I do think there are many ways that, and I think the Portland Police Bureau would agree that there's still a lot of room for improvement. But I don't think it's a scam. I don't think that some of the words you use to describe it are accurate. So that's just my opinion.
And can I add to this too? Because Susan, I'm looking at, you had referenced our comments on page 5. One of the things that we've really tried to push with PPB is to become a self-learning self-evaluating and self-changing organization. And what we've seen through the settlement agreement are things related to that. So for instance, doing training needs assessments, evaluating the training. We've provided a lot of technical assistance, and PPB has made large strides in evaluating not only whether officers liked the training, but was the training effective? Is there changes in knowledge? Is there changes in attitude? Similarly, looking at the force audit, I can tell you firsthand the ability of PPB to conduct trend analysis on force events has increased exponentially over the last 6 years. Their ability to provide evidence to policy division and training division that things need to be changed. That was something that wasn't there 6 years ago. So that's where I think that we're saying that the lessons learned from the settlement agreement can be used in the future. And I know that, even prior to, I believe you started coming to the last quarter, but prior to that last quarter, we made many references of, we identified this issue, but so did PPB before we did. And then they made these changes consistent with the trends. So these are things that we've seen PPB grow into, is the self-evaluative and self-changing organization. And I think that that's what we're saying is with what they've done as relates to the settlement agreement can be expanded out further into larger systems of ensuring equity.
Well, I would believe you I would be so excited with what you just said if the fact that this new experience of protesters made them lose their mind, apparently, because they have all these processes that they know how to document and they know how to follow, all of a sudden they became humans that did something completely different. I don't think so. And so what we have here in my mind is an incongruence between what you're saying, which I would just love to believe is true, and what we're experiencing out in the public.
We also have to remember what our report said, was that we have insufficient documentation related to use of force. We do know that FDCRs are being done. So the characterization that they've lost their minds and no longer can fill out force reports or evaluate force reports is premature at this moment, simply because we just don't have the documentation to assess that. And that's what our report said.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure about what a force report is, but on their website, they say they do not collect data on any of the protest arrests.
I appreciate the comments and the feedback, but I do want to keep it going. There's a number of other community comments. So if we can go to the next one, is that okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. We're gonna go next to Dan. And then after that, maybe we'll take one more community question, and then we'll close it out with some PSEP questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Dan Handelman again with Portland Cop Watch. And just in terms, I posted in the chat a link to a quarterly force report. The PPB has for over a year included crowd control data in the quarterly reports. So this whole thing about annual report only is not accurate. And you yourselves in the COCL report said there is no distinction in the agreement between violence at a protest and violence on an everyday interaction. So the fact that they've separated out at all is inappropriate. I also want to point out that the PPB, according to you, has not even finished their annual report for this year. The only year they had it in on time was last year, since 2012, when their agreement was signed. The traffic stop data that you pointed out is coming out on a quarterly basis. The 2018 report was supposed to have a breakout of the gun violence reduction team and its former self. That was never updated. The 2019 data still have not been published, and it's October of this year now. I just also want to point out, in terms of your reluctance to do anything around reanalyzing the 4.4% figure about the budget, this is a draft report. You have the ability to change that if you find better numbers, and I think you should. The person who was shot at the tail end of the second quarter had a mental health issue and a disability, and you don't mention that. You only give vague information about that. And then talking about the de-escalation of a couple of cases where people were not harmed, that's really nice to know, but you know, McDonald's serves 7 billion hamburgers and one person dies of food poisoning, that's significant. The person didn't get hit by a bullet, by the way, for people who don't know that. There's a mention about the Citizen Review Committee not necessarily following their standard of review because somebody said, I can see both sides have merit. Well, that's one way to analyze whether or not a reasonable person could come to the finding. So I don't think that's an appropriate analysis of CRC's discussions. There's no mention at all about the lack of officer ID, that the chief allowed them to cover over their name badges and put numbers on. I think that happened within this quarter that you're just reviewing. I know it did because it happened in the previous quarter and continued. And that's one of the also reasons that IPR is having a hard time identifying who the officers are, because they don't wear their name tags anymore, which is an outrage. And I echo, Maxine Bernstein raised this question too, but I had it on my list already. There are 485 officers who haven't met the minimum standards of training according to the state of Oregon. Does that mean that they're not certified police officers anymore? And if so, why are they still part of our police force?
You want a quick response to that? Well, Dan, you always bring up good points. I can't respond to all of them right now. There's too much here. We've made notes of them though, and we will respond to them in time. This thing about the budget still keeps bugging me, because you say, well, you better come up with better numbers. Well, it sounds like we're not in the business of coming up with better numbers. I'm coming up with accurate numbers. So we'll see if that needs to change or not.
I'm sorry, but you cherry picked the lowest seeming number. There's another number in that same paragraph of that same article that says we have the 19th lowest spending in terms of actual dollars spent. So you could have chosen that one, but you chose the one that made it look like we're spending the least. So that was a decision you made, regardless of whether or not you're going to reanalyze the numbers.
Okay, well, that was the number that they used to characterize across all the agencies, but that's all right. We'll look at it again. We should probably get more feedback from everybody else, I mean, rather than me answering all of them, unless you want me to.
Well, no, but I would like to either of you or maybe Mary Claire can speak to just the question that's brought up a couple of times now about the 480 officers and what the implications of them are that haven't received this training.
Yeah, Mary Claire, you want to respond to that? Because I think they have to have it by the end of the year. Is that right? Or you're seeking an extension from the state to an exception? Is that what the Bureau's trying to do?
DPST itself was closed during the pandemic as well. So the Bureau is not, Portland is not the only Bureau that is having difficulty meeting. There are certain requirements for like, having officers licensed, and they're a 3-year and a 1-year. And so right now they are not out of compliance. They are able to function as law enforcement. DPST is there. Several of them will be short a couple, but DPST is going to give an extension to anybody in the state who is short because of the, and all the 485 did receive half of the training. So the only piece that those 485 are missing are in fact the skills part, where they actually act out or practice the skills such as control tactics or what have you. So we did at least give them half of the in-service by putting the classes on LMS. And so all of those officers that didn't get to attend in person finished the classroom portion by May 31st. So the only thing they're missing is those hours that would have been, and those are going to be done, as COCL noted, beginning in January in the 2021 in-service.
And just to follow up with that, those 485 officers that have incomplete training, some of them, or probably all of them, are out on the streets, correct?
Well, I just want to caution to say that not all 485 may be short of training things, because it's over a 3-year period. So over 3 years, you have to have X number of, credits. And Brian, if you're want to speak to this, feel free to jump in, but there are certain requirements from DPST that you have to do on an annual basis, and the rest are within 3 years you have to complete certain things. So I wouldn't say that all 480, I couldn't say right now that all 485 are short of the credits that they need this year.
But some of them are, though.
So the Police Bureau provides training that exceeds the minimum standard for the state. When I was in the training division, I believe it was 84 hours of training was required in a 3-year period. And historically, the Police Bureau has provided 40 hours of in-service every year. So that would be 120 hours of training in any 3-year period. And so officers, while they may not have received a portion of their ongoing training, I would have to defer to the training division how many people will be in jeopardy of not meeting the 3-year state standards. So the Police Bureau is broken into, at one point was broken into thirds, and every year 1/3 of our officers came up for review on that 3-year cycle. And so I would have to defer to the training division on how many officers specifically won't meet their training in this 3-year cycle, but it's not going to be all 485.
Thank you. Being very cognizant of time, I do want to give this last 10 minutes to our PSEP members. Drop your questions, if you're community members, into the chat if you have additional ones. And then Dr. Rosenbaum and Dr. Christoph, if y'all can just make notes of those and respond to them on a separate time. I know, Dr. Rosenbaum, you've taken some other questions that you weren't able to answer a little earlier as well. But to get us started with our PSEP, we will go with Vadim, then Elliot, and then Amy.
Dr. Rosenbaum, two questions backing up on each other. The first one, would it be safe to say that the top 3 reasons why non-compliance was found was the coronavirus effects, the protests/riots, as well as the budgetary issues?
Let's see, am I on? Yeah. Yeah, Vadim, I think those would be the top 3 because the management decision is linked to the budget. So I think that would be management/budget would be the 3rd one, yes.
And so let's say tomorrow, for the sake of argument, those 3 issues were eliminated. The COVID was cured, the downtown protests ended, and the budget was adequate. Have you seen any systemic issues out of the non-compliance part of the report that would continue, that you feel would continue absent those circumstances?
That's a really good question. Most of the systems are in place, as we talked about before. They require some revisions. I mean, the fear that the protests could come back or continue on requires the Bureau to make adjustments there, and I think they have. We need more details about all of those changes, but in responding more quickly to both on the street and in terms of their reviewing of force and that sort of thing. Training, yeah, I mean, that one, if it really, I haven't done an analysis, a staffing analysis entirely of the Portland Police Training Bureau, Training Division, to see exactly how much staffing that would require. But because there are such major constraints now, and they've lost, their budget has been cut, and but I think they have the systems in place. They have the needs assessment. They have the training plan. They have systems in place to make training work. But you just can't stop the training like that for an extended period and expect everything to just go smoothly for a while. And it's just like, you know, anyway, I don't want to go on and on. Just like our nation isn't going to recover from this pandemic tomorrow either. It's going to take time, but it's just harder right now when they're very hard. And I don't want to get in the middle of the budget thing, except to say, if you can come up with a cheaper way of doing things, great.
Dean, I think it's difficult to predict if all of those things went away, would there be any issues? I think one of the things that we can say and that we do say in this report is those three things impacted their operations. They had an impact, but I'm not sure if we can predict in the future what would happen.
Thanks.
Okay, we're gonna go to Elliot and Amy. Just want you to be conscious, we are really tight on time.
Yeah, Dennis, thanks for the report. So, I mean, in response to that last question about what they could have done, I think Dan has suggested in the chat and other people have suggested if they weren't sending out so many police to brutalize protesters, they would have fewer reports to do and they would have more resources to do the rest of their work. My question is really about a philosophical question. So I too was interested to see that your report found the city out of compliance, but when you drill down into how that you found the city out of compliance, it's basically they didn't do their paperwork on time, they didn't do the training. And in part, you can't make a determination about the use of force because they haven't provided the data. But anyone who looks at the videos, who looks at the data on 100 uses of tear gas in June, knows that there was an extreme use of force. And you know, until it's investigated, I understand you can't make a determination precisely, but I think that it's clear that all of this use of force should be considered. And so if you're a citizen in the city, what you're experiencing in the city is a dramatic increase of use of force. And I feel like the report should in some way reflect that, whereas now it focuses on the paperwork. And then the broader context in terms of the regular systems outside of the protests, you know, if you look at traffic stops, if you look at use of force data, it not only continues to be highly discriminatory, but your own data and the PPV data suggests it's getting worse in the last quarter, from 17 to 18% from first quarter to second quarter in terms of the number of Black Portlanders stopped. The use of force data, you know, the overall numbers minus the protests go down. But if you look at who is actually those use of force incidents are being used against, 25% of them in the second quarter were Black people. 47% were houseless. 21% were people experiencing a mental health crisis. These numbers are wildly disproportionate to their presence in the population. And I think there should be some recognition of that in the report beyond simply the fact that, you know, they didn't turn their paperwork in on time. And I know this is an outcomes versus training thing, but frankly, if you say they've been doing the training right and have the systems in place since 2014 to do this, and we're now in 2020 and we still see these discriminatory outcomes, the training is not working. And that worries me in terms of the settlement agreement, because if the settlement agreement is just looking at the training and the training is not producing the results we want, either in terms of use of force or discriminatory policing, then we have a problem. In terms of PSEP, you know, you brought this up, mentioned this before. It's true that the city has met with us ad nauseum. We've been going to meetings all the time, but the fact that 4 out of 5 of our reports since the end of May were not responded to. And as of today, we've only received 1 response to the qualified immunity thing, which just came in a few days ago after 4 months. 4 of them, after repeated attempts to ask the city for a response, we have not received any response for. So if PSEP is actually functioning and not just checking a box in the settlement agreement, you would think the city would not only want to meet with us, but would actually want to respond in substance to our recommendations. And after we've brought this up time and again, they simply have not. In fact, that other recommendation, which we finally got the approval for, the official notice of, that was actually signed on June 24th. So these papers are just sitting around the office somewhere. There seems to be no evidence that the city is either considering or taking seriously PSEP recommendations.
Okay, that's important to hear. Thank you, Elliot. You make a lot of good points there, and we've taken some notes. This last one you've mentioned about the recommendations, I've done a little homework on that, but I really do feel that the city needs to respond more to that. Some of the problem is apparently PSEP's been sending them to the mayor's office, and the police department and doesn't always get involved in those. That some are more appropriate for them, and some are outside, I guess, involve the DA's office in some of these matters. So I'm not going to make up excuses for them. I think we will look into that more carefully and find out where everything is.
Well, none of the recommendations I'm referring to, they were all directed to the mayor, and as police commissioner, he is the one who's responsible for responding.
For distributing them, yes. Okay.
And responding.
So a lot has been said this evening. We got one more person. We got Amy, who's going to give us the last question to close it out. And then we'll wrap things
mine
up.
is going to be simple and kind of painless. I'm hoping that in a culture of change, the world of mental illness has kind of been morphed into a dual conversation called behavioral health. And I would very much appreciate it if you could change your wording in your reports to reflect the language that the population I serve is really wanting to use. And that would be behavioral health challenges or in a behavioral health crisis. There's two ways you can use the term to reflect someone. So I really would appreciate that. That's all I wanted to ask.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom, we can do that, can't we?
Yep. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, definitely.
Good job, Amy.
Yeah.
I need to, is your mic off?
Thank you on that. I want to thank Dr. Rosenbaum and Dr. Christoph for spending these last 2 hours with us and answering all of these questions and giving us this report. Appreciate all the community members who shared their input and spoke their truth, and to our PSEP members as well. Only thing I would add, just kind of in recapping it, is I think Ann had just mentioned, based off of Elliot's points, is just the continued our discussion about outcomes and the response to the work that we've been producing on PSEP. And also, a lot of this that was said tonight was inferred from, we're trying to make assumptions or inferences about the Portland Police Bureau's decision on why things happen. And I think a follow-up conversation needs to be had, at least internally, but I know the public would want to hear it too, and hear directly from the Portland Police Bureau as to why these things, why they didn't keep up with training, why they didn't keep up with the forest reports beyond just what things happen in the world. And I'm particularly concerned with, especially given that the Department of Justice didn't approve anything, why they would risk substantial compliance being this close to being done and not try and find any possible way to keep in with that. So that is puzzling to me. So I think what a great next step, in addition to Dr. Rosenbaum and Dr. Christoph, if y'all could please follow up with the questions that you did receive. I think that PSEP should consider meeting with the chief or inviting the chief to our meeting to talk specifically about these lapses in substantial compliance and hear directly from them about why the decisions were made they were. But I will say, based on everything here, that it is a lot of stuff going on. That's just how I'll categorize it. And the final thing that I just did want to mention is that today would be George Floyd's 47th birthday. So just sending him energy and his family and everybody else who's fighting to live in our country. So thank you all for being here. I don't know, Dr. Rosenbaum, and Dr. Christoph, you have any closing comments?
Oh, just to thank you all. These were some very good comments tonight and good suggestions. So we will digest those and incorporate some of those and respond to them as we always do publicly on the website, in addition to our revised report.
Thank you. And the community can count on PSIP to continue this. It's not a conversation that just ends here. We'll be following up in our subcommittees and our steering committee with this work and with other work around policing. And our next full body meeting is at the end of this month on October 27th on Zoom at 5 to 8 p.m. We've extended it back to our 3-hour time because there's so much going on. So thank you all for being here tonight, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you all.
Talk, Anna. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to end this, but I appreciate all your time. You're wonderful. See ya.